We're here to discuss the relationship between faith and reason, or faith and evidence. We're not treating those as the same thing, but they're two very closely related phenomena or debates. And in particular, we're going to talk about W.K. Clifford's argument today, and he does not relate it directly to faith. He's talking in general about having evidence for your beliefs, and he makes a very strong claim that you should always base your beliefs upon sufficient evidence. So we're going to talk about that argument, why he might believe that. We're going to try to kind of hypothesize, extrapolate a little bit to figure out what his argument might be. We're going to ask some questions about that argument and relate it to the debate at hand. Because as I said, he's talking about your general beliefs. They should generally be based on sufficient evidence. What does that mean for faith? We saw in talking about Plantinga how we could actually have conflicts between faith and reason without that being a strong conflict, without that being the kind of conflict that would undermine either thing, either faith or reason, right? We tend to think of conflict when we talk about the conflict between faith and reason. When someone says, faith is incompatible with reason, what they're really trying to say is that if you're reasonable, you won't have faith. Reason sort of delivers a verdict, which means our faith is irrational. We shouldn't accept the claims that we accept on faith. But Plantinga says, well, there's a sense in which our faith and reason is in conflict, but it's a weak conflict. There are kinds of conflicts between faculties or sources of belief that don't undermine either source of belief. So if I say, here's an example, the example I gave in that video. These two claims are perfectly compatible. If I'm looking just at the evidence that I have right in front of me, it's not raining. I would conclude that it's not raining. So here's one source of belief, the evidence that's right in front of me, the things I can sense with my five senses. That's compatible with the claim that it's raining, right? Because I might have a different source of evidence, that is maybe an app on my phone or a website that I'm looking at or a friend that I'm talking to who is outside my house who is telling me, oh, it actually is raining outside your house. It's just this weird situation where it's not raining out the window or whatever. It's an optical illusion or whatever. So those two things, however, are compatible. To say in the same breath, if I were judging purely on the basis of the evidence of my five senses currently, I would conclude that it's not raining. I can also say it is raining because taking the broader picture, taking further evidence beyond the mere evidence available to me in my five senses currently right now, I would conclude that it is raining because I have a friend on the phone. That's something beyond my five senses. I have a weather app or a website app. Now you might get clever and say, well, you're getting that through your senses too. But I'm saying, well, if I'm talking about the perception that I have directly, if I were just taking that into consideration, I would conclude that it wasn't raining. And I can also say it is raining. So that's a conflict. Those two sources of belief deliver different verdicts. One says it's not raining, one says it is raining, but neither undermines the other. I can hold both of those in my head at the same time. On this basis, I would conclude this. On this basis, I would conclude this other thing, but neither undermines the other. So Plantinga's big point is faith and reason might be like that. Especially, he's talking specifically about science. If it is the case that science delivers the verdict that God doesn't exist or something like this, I'm skeptical that it does. But if it were to, Plantinga says that's only because it's operating on certain methodological assumptions. That is, assumptions for the sake of argument or for the sake of seeing what follows from those assumptions. And one of those assumptions is naturalism. That is, that supernatural beings or events are not explanatory of the observable data. Now, essentially what that is doing is the same thing as my example. Science is saying we're going to constrain our evidence to a certain type and see what conclusions we can get. And that can be useful, right? Just like it can be useful to talk about what would I conclude if I were judging just on the basis of my direct perceptions about the rain, right? But Plantinga says it doesn't conflict with that to say that God exists. Because of course, when you constrain your evidence to be things, or constrain your explanations of the evidence to be only non-godlike things, of course the conclusion is going to be that God doesn't exist. And if you take into account the further evidence and all the other kinds of explanations, that is those that take into account or allow for the existence of gods or supernatural beings, then you can conclude that God exists. And so we've got a case of weak conflict here, Plantinga says. Now, ultimately today we're talking about W.K. Clifford's argument. And what we're going to see today is another kind of another argument that sort of undermines this this popular belief in the conflict between faith and reason. And what we're going to see today, to give you a spoiler alert, is that unless we define faith and reason in such a way that it kind of like by definition they're in conflict, you can have evidence for religious claims, for claims that are typically conceived to be claims of faith. In fact, it'd be weird for that not to be the case, and we'll give you some examples, or I'll give you some examples. So it's going to look like however we define evidence, or however at least the way we should define evidence, there can be evidence for the claims of faith. It doesn't make them any less claims of faith for that reason. All right, let's get down to it. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and start the slideshow, just so y'all don't have to look at all that stuff. So now I'm gonna be very clear. I want you to direct your attention to the conclusion of this argument. Clifford is arguing this: it's always wrong to believe something without sufficient evidence. You can have a lot of questions about this conclusion. You should have a lot of questions about this conclusion. What is evidence? What is sufficient evidence? Sufficient just means enough, right? So you shouldn't believe something without enough evidence. Well, what makes something enough, right? That's a really vague sort of qualifier on there. So, but that's what he's arguing. That we can sort of see that there's content to that. It at least implies that you have to have evidence for your beliefs. So if you were to define faith as belief without any evidence, then you should never believe things on faith if this conclusion is right. Let's talk just a few minutes about the argument I'm constructing for this conclusion. It's an extrapolation. I'm not saying this is there in Clifford's article. I think you would have to have something like this argument to establish so strong a conclusion. He's clearly arguing on the basis of harms that can come about as a result of believing without sufficient evidence. Take his initial example, for example. He gives this example. He says, imagine a guy who's sending a ship out to sea. It's a ship that ferries people to and from wherever. It doesn't matter. I think he's talking about England and probably talking about ferrying people to America. I don't know, maybe to France, whatever. That's the purpose of the ship. The guy owns the ship. He makes money off the people paying him to ferry them to and from America. Even though he doesn't go on the ship, he owns it. He pays the captain, whatever. He pays the crew, and then he makes a big profit. And he kind of sees some evidence that the ship is not in tip-top shape. In fact, it's kind of rickety. There's maybe a good reason to think that it might not make this voyage, but let's say he is very selective in the evidence that he pays attention to, right? There's no Facebook yet, so he can't totally manage his sources of news and evidence like we can, but he goes and talks to the right people that he knows are like really optimistic, or maybe even he talks to people who also have a financial stake in the success of this sort of thing. Maybe he talks to the guy who's going to repair the ship. You know, if he was going to decommission the ship wouldn't need repairs, and so this guy wouldn't get paid. So he goes to that guy and says, hey, do you think we could send this thing out again if you repair it? And the guy of course has an incentive to say, yeah, of course, because he's going to make a lot of money off of this, getting paid to repair the ship. Now, background assumption, this is in the 1800s. Okay, so we're talking about a wooden ship, right? Very different sort of thing. So long story short, this guy sort of ignores the evidence that the ship is not seaworthy, and he believes without sufficient evidence that the ship is seaworthy. So he's believing something on insufficient evidence. Ship goes out, sinks, everybody dies. And Clifford says it's his fault. He did something wrong in believing without sufficient evidence that the ship was seaworthy. That was wrong of him. That sounds a little bit weird to us to talk about the wrongness of a belief. We usually talk about the moral wrongness of actions. But part of the shock value of this sort of article is that, no, your beliefs can be wrong too. His believing that without sufficient evidence, or at least his way of believing that was wrong, it was wrong because it ended up harming somebody. He wouldn't have sent the ship out if he hadn't formed the belief without sufficient evidence. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. So look, it's a real strong claim. It's always wrong to believe something without sufficient evidence. So I think it requires a really strong argument. And so I'm kind of throwing together an argument by hypothesis, knowing that he's concerned with harm to other people. I think that our argument would have to go something like this, that believing something without sufficient evidence always harms other people. And it's always, if something always harms other people, it's always wrong to do it. And so it's always wrong to believe something without sufficient evidence. Is that his argument? I don't know. Maybe he ultimately is just stating the conclusion this strongly for shock value. Maybe he wants to come back off of this conclusion, make it a little weaker. But if we maintain that conclusion in its really strong form, I think it requires something as strong as this argument. Okay, so there's a lot of questions here. I mentioned one of the questions was about evidence. What is the nature of evidence? The plausibility of Clifford's claims will depend on how we define evidence, right? So look at my first example. What is evidence? You might think, and some people will be tempted to say, well, it's confirmation with one of our five senses. That's sort of the classic kind of old school model of scientific confirmation. You get evidence for something when you have an observation of some kind, when you see something, you hear something, you feel something, taste something even. I have to say smell now that I've mentioned the other four. So you have a theory that, I don't know, whatever. Gravity works a certain way. You watch a ball fall in a certain way, and that's evidence for your theory, right? Your perception, your visual perception of the ball falling in a certain way. Or maybe it's a little more complicated. You have tools of measurement, but it's still an observation. You're tracking the speed of the ball as it falls. You've got questions about the acceleration of the ball or something like that. And so you get a little radar gun and you track it or whatever. It's still an observation though. Sort of the classic sense of evidence. But here's the crazy thing. If that's what we mean by evidence, then Clifford's claim is totally off the wall crazy. Because think about our historical beliefs, for example. Think about all the things you learned in your history classes. Think of, in particular, just to give it a particular case, I'm thinking of Texas history. My wife is teaching Texas history. In Texas, you still take Texas history in the 7th grade. Take the claim. Let's take a less popular claim. Stay away from the Alamo and give you a new one. Sam Houston defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. That's a claim. It's a historical claim. It happened. I think we want to say we have a really good reason, and it's totally rational to believe that happened. Very well documented. However, none of us saw that. None of us heard it happen. None of us tasted it or smelled it or whatever, felt it happen, right? We don't have any confirmation by our senses that this happened. No direct perception in any way. But it still seems like it's a reasonable thing to believe. And so if we interpret evidence, if we require sufficient evidence for all of our beliefs, and evidence is interpreted as perception by one of our senses, then it looks like we've got to say, well, crap, I mean, basically all of our historical beliefs are unjustified. We shouldn't. It's wrong for us to believe those things, according to Clifford. That should tell us that we're conceiving of evidence too narrowly. It still seems like we should be able to say that we have evidence for the claim that that Sam Houston defeated Santa Anna in the Battle of San Jacinto. And here's my suggestion to cut to the chase in terms of how we should understand the nature of evidence. Let's say that just evidence for a claim is anything that increases the probability that that claim is true. So let's say you don't know anything about Texas history. Someone tells you, hey, or someone asks you, hey, do you think that Sam Houston beat Santa Anna at San Jacinto? And you say, I don't know. I mean, I don't know anything about Texas history. And then they tell you, okay, well, this historian, let's say H.W. Brands, who is a historian at UT Austin, wrote a really good book called Lone Star Nation, highly recommend. H.W. Brands says that Sam Houston did beat Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. Is the fact that H.W. Brands said it evidence that it's true? I think so on this definition, because it actually greatly increases the probability that the claim is true. Because a very prominent, well-read historian, and not only that, but a historian who has kind of specialized in Texas history and knows a ton about this era of Texas history, thinks that it's true and has done a lot of research on it. That skyrockets the probability that it's true, right? So that would count as evidence. So we actually do have evidence for our historical claims, because testimony from experts can count as evidence. Okay, so I think that's how, if we're interpreting Clifford charitably, if we're trying to be nice and make him not be committed to totally crazy claims, that's how we should read evidence. It's anything that increases the probability that the relevant claim is true. So now here's the question. Can we have evidence for the claims of faith? Can we have evidence for the claims of faith? Is there any fact we could learn that would increase the probability that a claim of faith is true? Well, let me point out a couple of cases that I think we typically, lots of people, depending on your religion, I'm going to focus on the case of Christianity right now, just because the artwork was more readily available to my mind. The top painting is a painting of the resurrection by El Greco. And I guess it's not really a representation of a spiritual reality, but it's a much more idealized or abstracted representation of that reality, right? Real people do not look like the Jesus Christ figure in this picture. Real people don't fall, like this, etc. And what the bottom picture, I'm actually blanking on the artist's name here, but it's a painting that the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky was obsessed with. He actually talks about it a ton in his novel, The Idiot. And it was kind of indicative of a mood that was happening in Europe around Christianity at this time in the mid to late 1800s, where it was a focus on sort of the realism of religious claims. In fact, there was a growing cynicism and skepticism. That's why paintings like this were so controversial at the time. A growing cynicism and skepticism about religious claims, a growing challenging of those claims. There was a theologian named Schleiermacher in Germany, who actually started a big movement that ended up liberalizing a lot of theology that was skeptical of any supernatural claims within religion, any claims to supernatural events that violated the laws of nature. For example, the resurrection, right? The resurrection of Jesus is, on most accounts, unless you're going to have to do a lot of explaining, a violation of the laws of nature. And so there was a movement in art that sort of accompanied this movement in theology. And what you have at the bottom is a painting, a sort of realistic, an attempt at a realistic portrayal of what the dead body of Christ would look like. And Dostoevsky he famously said about this painting that a man could lose his faith looking at this painting. Okay, so what am I trying to get at with these two paintings? Well, what I'm trying to say is, we are often tempted to think about the claims of religion or the claims of faith in these sort of idealized, spiritualized terms. That's sort of what I'm trying to get at with the representation in the El Greco painting. as if they don't have real world consequences and real world empirical entailments. But what I'm trying to get at in the second painting, or sort of gesture at, is that the claims of religion, the claims of faith, often do have real world empirical entailments or consequences. If Jesus Christ really did die, really was resurrected, these are empirical claims. There's the claim that his body actually was killed. He did not have biological life in it anymore. And that 3 days later, on the third day, it came back to life and walked around and talked to people. Jesus was there. He was alive. It's not a spiritual reality being gestured at as much as some fringe theologians want to interpret it. It is actually clearly in the gospel narratives the claim to something that could be empirically verified, right? People would have seen this happening. And what the Gospels say, and the book of Acts says, is that people did see it happening. So what I'm trying to get at, I'm not making claims about Christianity in particular. I'm using Christianity as a example. I don't think this is unique to Christianity. My point is the claims of faith often will have evidence for them if they're true. In fact, they would have originally had, in many cases, the kind of more narrow kind of evidence for them. People would have actually observed or perceived things with their five senses differently than if the claims weren't true. If Jesus was resurrected, people were going to see him walking around. We're going to hear him talk. We're going to feel the wounds in his side and his hands, like Thomas allegedly did. If he didn't rise, if he wasn't resurrected, no one would have those observations, right? Or they most likely would not have those observations. I guess it's possible that they could have hallucinated everything, but most likely they would not have had those observations. So we have to ask ourselves, isn't it the case then that there could be evidence for a religious claim? What if we do find out? What if you're in, 30 whatever AD and someone tells you that they just saw Jesus? They just felt the wound in his side. Or what if you are that person who goes to the tomb and finds that he's not there and then sees him walking around, right? Hears him talking, shakes hands with him, eats a meal with him. That would be evidence for a claim of faith. The claim of faith is that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. You might say, well, then it's not a claim of faith, but this is the central doctrine of a major world religion, Christianity, that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. It is a doctrine, it's a claim or a belief that could be empirically verified, could have empirical evidence for it. Observation could confirm this thing. And similarly, it's a historical event. It's just like Santa Anna losing to Sam Houston at the Battle of San Jacinto. If it happened, people could have seen it happen and written it down and told other people who told other people who told other people who eventually, wrote some things down, which H.W. Brands read, and then you hear him testify that the thing happened. So this is not to say that there's evidence or good evidence or bad evidence for the claim that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. The point is, it's the kind of event that could have evidence for it. There's nothing in conflict there's nothing to say that it's in principle just impossible for there to be evidence for this religious claim. So take that back all the way to our revised definition of evidence. Evidence for a claim is anything that increases the probability that that claim is true. Well, again, go back, make the direct analogy to the San Jacinto case. If someone who was at the tomb tells you it's empty, does that increase the probability that Jesus rose from the dead? Yes, it does, right? Because if there had still been a body there, it would have confirmed that he hadn't risen. If the person says that there was no body there, it doesn't confirm completely. It doesn't prove that Jesus was resurrected. He could have been stolen. His body could have been stolen by the disciples or whatever, but it at least slightly bumps up the probability that he was resurrected. What if you see someone who looks just like Jesus who says, I'm Jesus, I was just resurrected? What if you put your hands into the wounds in his side, right? Each one of those things is going to increase the probability that Jesus was resurrected, and so would count as evidence. So again, not to say that there's actually evidence for this. This is not me preaching to you. I'm using this particular case It's going to be true for any given religion. If Muhammad did the things that Islam says that he did, we should expect there to be certain evidence for it. There could, in principle, be evidence for the claims of this faith, right? So Muhammad, when he's taken up to heaven, what if there's nothing saying that someone couldn't have seen that and testified, I saw this thing. Similarly, the claims of Mormonism, for example, Joseph Smith said, I found these tablets in the woods. Someone could have seen those tablets, right? Someone could have even testified to the trustworthiness of Joseph Smith. And each one of those things is going to increase the probability that this thing is true. Not to say that that evidence is there, but that it could be there, right? So there's nothing in conflict. There's nothing contradictory about the notion of having evidence for a claim of faith. That's the point. Okay, so here's some questions about the argument. We'll end with this. The first question is it really, Clifford says that it's when the guy believes without sufficient evidence that his ship is seaworthy, he says that harms someone in the end. People end up dying because of that belief. But one question, or really it's more of a challenge, an objection, is it really your belief that harms the people, or is it your acting on the belief, right? Because look at the chain of events. It's not like you believe the thing and instantaneously all these people die, right? There's lots of other dominoes that have to fall. And in particular, one really important domino is that your believing it has to cause you to act in a certain way, that is sending the ship out to sea. And then really it's more like your action of sending the ship out to sea is what causes the people to die. So shouldn't we say it's wrong to do things, to take actions that end up harming people, whereas beliefs just make certain actions more likely? Well, it looks like the belief is merely making the harmful action way more likely. You're certainly more likely to send the ship out to sea if you believe that it's seaworthy, right? If you believed that it wasn't seaworthy, you probably wouldn't send it out to sea. If you believe that it is seaworthy, you probably will send it out to sea. And now we have to ask, well, maybe Clifford could say, well, I'm not saying that your belief causes the harm, but your belief makes it way more likely that the harm is going to happen because of your action, because your belief makes it way more likely that you're going to act in a harmful way. And maybe that's what makes the believing on the basis of insufficient evidence wrong. So now the question is something wrong just because it makes a harmful action way more likely? That's less clear. It may be clear that a really harmful action is wrong, but can it be just as wrong to believe something that makes that action really likely or probable? So here's another question. Do all of our beliefs, okay, let me actually go back. I didn't answer that question. I'm saying it's less clear that something is wrong just because it makes a wrong action much more likely. You could still argue that point, right? Like you could argue this point. This might be what makes it wrong when someone spreads some horrible conspiracy theory, right? You call that action wrong because it made harm much more likely. Let's talk about the case of Pizzagate, where someone spread a conspiracy theory about a pizza parlor running some sort of child prostitution ring or something in the back. It's totally false, no evidence for it. But then someone read that conspiracy theory online, took it for truth, and showed up at the pizza parlor with a gun. Now, the person who showed up with the gun did something wrong, but it looks like maybe even more so the person who spread the lie did something wrong, because it's not because they caused harm directly, it's because they did something that made such harm much more likely. Okay, so it does seem like Clifford could make the argument there. Here's another question though. Is it actually true that whenever we have a belief not based on sufficient evidence, it even makes it much more likely that we harm someone? I could form a belief without sufficient evidence right now. I could say, I believe that there are 11 planets in our solar system. Now, assume for the sake of argument that I could just get myself to believe this. I actually don't believe it, but maybe somehow I could just get myself to believe it, even though I have no evidence for it. Is it going to harm someone? Is it going to make it even more likely that I harm someone? How could it even? how could it harm someone? How could it lead to harm reliably? How could it make harm to others much more probable, like, or to the point of being probable, not just much more probable, but actually being likely, right? It doesn't seem like it could. And so, but remember, we said that Clifford's argument required, if he really wants to establish this strong conclusion that it's always wrong to believe on insufficient evidence, he needs this strong premise that it's always going to harm someone, or may at least make it very likely that someone is harmed, to believe something without sufficient evidence. But it looks like there are cases where that's not actually true. And finally, this is a maybe, I think this is maybe the weakest consideration against Clifford's argument. Is it always wrong to harm someone? Or if we modify in the way suggested by the first question, is it always wrong to make it more likely that I harm someone, or to make it even probable that I harm someone? I'll leave this to y'all to think about cases where it doesn't seem wrong to harm someone. But then again, maybe Clifford could say, look, I'm not talking about cases where you harm in self-defense. I'm saying it's wrong to believe on insufficient evidence because it leads to unprovoked harm, or something like that. Okay, and that is where we'll end for now.